Welcome to Ben Lomond Historic Site. My name is Lance, and today we're going to be talking about the architecture of Ben Lomond. Ben Lomond is a wonderful surviving example of late Federalist style architecture, built in 1832, so right at the very end of the Federalist period. Now, we're standing not in front of the house, but we're actually standing on the road that approached the house in its historic location. We call this the Jackson Road, and it runs from the south going north towards the Manassas battlefield. This is the main approach that anyone coming to the house would see. And the reason why we start here is because the first view you have of the house is actually off axis or not directly centered. Now, the reason why the house was built this way is we believe that it's because when you approach it, this is the Greek approach. And the main approach to the house when you actually enter it is from the Roman approach. Now, the reason why this was done is houses like this were built during a time period when wealthy men built houses to communicate with each other about their education, their class, and their status. Washington did this, Jefferson did this, and so this house is built in the tradition of the founding fathers. Now, anyone coming to the house would see this and understand that, I'm seeing the Greek approach, which gives you the depth and the breadth of the house, and then the front of it is where you would enter and then have a formal approach on the Roman promenade. A little bit about the house and how it became is we've talked about the landscape. This house was built in 1832, and it's built in the Federalist style. Federalist style dominated from the 1780s, just after the American Revolution was winding down, all the way until the 1820s. Now, this house is a wonderful example of Federalist architecture. It is what's called a 5-bay because you have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 sets of windows, and it's perfectly symmetrical, and that was a huge part of the Federalist style architecture. This particular one was built for Benjamin Tasker Chin, a young man who inherited about 2,000 acres here, and when he arrived here, he said, "I want to make something of it." Now, he didn't have the skilled labor to build the house, therefore he went to his cousin over at Liberia Plantation, Harriet Blatchett Weir, and he rented skilled enslaved laborers to build the house. And it is built very similar to both Liberia and also other Carter plantations. I like to think of this as a monument to both the Carter family style of architecture and the enslaved person's skills for those who built it. Throughout the house, you'll see very high level of craftsmanship in the woodwork, the stone masonry. Everything that makes the house is a very high fashion and high level of construction. This is the view from the road approaching from the south. And here we get to see the breadth and the depth of the house. So we see its grandeur. Now, Ben Lomond is a bit of an oddity here. You see outbuildings in front of the view from the road. Why is that? Good question. There's a lot of mysteries to this place. We think that it may be to create sort of a prominence to show how much is here, or it may have just been for practical purposes. Now, one particular visitor that came here became a resident, and she was the young bride of Benjamin Tasker Chin, who had this house built. Now, when she approaches from the south, she arrives here in 1838. She's of Scottish descent, and when she comes to what was historically called the Cancer Plantation, she says, "Hi, Benjamin, I love the house, but I hate the name. Would you mind if I changed it?" And so she changed this plantation from Cancer Plantation to Ben Lomond, which in Scottish roughly translates to Beacon Mountain. Why would she call it that? Well, where we stand, we're standing on about 15 feet of fill dirt. The house actually sat on a much more pronounced hill. And so if you think about that and you look at the historic landscape, all of this has been filled in. So she would have seen a house on a hill, and it makes a lot more sense why she would name it Beacon Mountain. Standing in front of Ben Lomond, and this is the Roman approach. There's a few clues that tell us exactly why this is the front of the house and how guests would approach it. The two trees beside me, while not historic, are in their historic positions. and we have a row of stumps that date back to the historic building of the house. This is the Roman promenade approach, and so any guest coming to the house would be approaching the house on axis. And so this is the second part of that, entertaining guests and showing them that Benjamin understands the classical Greek as well as the classical Roman. When we look at the details of Ben Lomond, we see some really neat parts of the construction. There's a question of what do you do when you have large window openings and heavy stone? How do you keep it from collapsing? Well, the key is this keystone right here. And so these wedge-shaped stones are cut and put into the middle of the lintel or the bar over the windows, and that keeps it from collapsing in on itself. Now, throughout the house, you'll see this, and you'll see this very high level of construction that the enslaved builders used. The shame is that it didn't look anything like this when they were finished, because today we all love the look of this rough-cut country fieldstone, and everybody who visits Ben Lomond says, "Oh, I love the stone. It looks like the stone house." Well, I got bad news for you. In 1832, when this was built, that's not how it was done. After the whole house was finished, all the stones were cut, it was covered in a stucco, and then rustication patterns, or this grand pattern to make it look like the monuments of Washington, D.C., were cut into the drying stucco. And the reason why they did this is because it was an embarrassment to build out of fieldstone in 1832. It was actually cheaper to build out of stone than out of lumber, because lumber was a new thing. And so instead, he covered it because he said a proper gentleman is not going to be embarrassed by the construction of his home. Now, if this concept sounds familiar to you, it was very common practice to use this. George Washington did the same thing with wood blocks that were cut to look like magnificent granite stones, and then he threw sand on drying paint to give it the look that it was actually stone. Now, this house went through several iterations. After that, we see a beautiful federal house. However, then at some point between 1832 and 1850, there was a front porch added to this, also stuccoed, and it turned it more into a Greek revival style house that became in vogue after the Federalist period. The question that begs to be answered in this house is, why was it built? It is 26 miles from Alexandria, which at the time that this house was built, Alexandria was one of the great hubs of fashion for the young United States. Well, let's get a little bit of historic context as to why it was built. One is the Federalist period came after the Georgian period, and the Federalist period was the Americans' response to winning the American Revolution. And they said, you know what? We want to be American. We are not British anymore. And so they decided to have a new American style called Federalist. And so, ironically, is the founding fathers and young Americans all looked to none other than British pattern books for the new Federalist style. Now, the Federalist style is a lot more subdued than the heavy, gaudy Georgian style that you would see at places like Mount Vernon. The Federalist style also came in on the heels of winning the American Revolution and forming a new American identity. It's also about the time that, Thomas Jefferson is sharing his thoughts on his vision of a great American agrarian society. You also have to remember George Washington, while he's general president, he fancies himself after the Roman general Cincinnatus, who was the great statesman farmer. So this idea that masculinity and American identity is tied to the farmer is where the Federalist style is born. And so this house that you see is the manifestation of that. You see a subdued farmhouse, albeit for gentlemen farmers. And so it's supposed to be simpler. It's supposed to be a more rural, agrarian, pastoral life. And so Benjamin Tasker Chin, when he arrives here, he's a gentleman farmer. And he says, you know what? My grandfather and great-great-grandfather have beat the Brits several times over, both in court and in the American Revolution. It's patriotic as a Carter family member to build in this federal style. And so that's why you see so many houses that the Carters built or relatives of the Carters built in this federal style. And so today you see what is very much an American patriotic home at the start of our young nation. I hope you enjoyed the tour here. This is just a small snippet of what you would see if you come to Ben Lomond. If you want more information, if you want to see the inside of the house, if you want to know more, or I'll even tell you dad jokes, then come over to Ben Lomond and we will be happy to give you a tour. Thanks for taking the time to watch.